I'm going to tell you something. Most doctors either avoid, overlook, or assume you would never feel comfortable asking about. And I'm no longer interested in that silence, because that silence is exactly what keeps people confused about their own bodies. We are going to talk about sex. We are going to talk about blood flow. And we are going to talk about something far more practical than most people expect. Food, real food you can find in any grocery store. Food that can create measurable changes in how your body performs, responds, and feels. Not in theory, but in real physiology. Before anyone becomes uncomfortable or decides to leave, stay with me here. Because this is not about embarrassment. It is not about performance anxiety. And it is certainly not about shame. This is about biology. This is about how your body actually works and how deeply your daily choices are connected to your sexual health, your heart, and your overall vitality. Let's start where this conversation should always begin, but rarely does, with blood. Because at the core of sexual function, there is one simple truth. Sexual arousal is not just emotional. It is not just psychological. It is a circulatory event. It is about blood moving efficiently through your vessels, reaching the right tissues at the right time, in the right amount. When that flow is strong, everything works as intended. When it is restricted, everything downstream begins to suffer. In men, this often appears as erectile dysfunction, a term that is far too often misunderstood, because erectile dysfunction is not a personality issue. It is not a failure of masculinity. It is a vascular signal. It is your body indicating that blood is not reaching where it needs to go with enough strength or consistency. And once you understand that, the entire conversation changes. It stops being something to hide and becomes something to improve. In women, the process is different in appearance, but identical in principle. Arousal depends on what we call vasocongestion. That means increased blood flow to the pelvic region, the swelling of delicate tissues, the natural lubrication response, the sensitivity that makes intimacy feel alive and responsive. When blood flow is reduced, these processes become muted. Arousal takes longer. Sensation feels weaker, and the experience becomes less complete. Many women are never told that this is physiological. They are often led to believe it is normal aging or something to simply tolerate. But that is not the full picture. Because blood flow is not fixed, it is dynamic, and it responds directly to your internal environment. Which brings us to something very important. Food, not supplements, not complicated treatments, but everyday foods that influence circulation at a cellular level. And I want you to understand this clearly. What you eat does not just affect your health in a vague sense. It changes how your blood vessels behave, how your cells communicate, and how efficiently your body responds to stimulation. Now let's begin with one of the most surprising examples, watermelon. Most people think of watermelon as simple fruit, something refreshing, something light. But biologically, it plays a much more interesting role. Watermelon contains a compound called citrulline. This amino acid is present in both the flesh and the rind. Once you consume it, your body converts citrulline into arginine. And arginine is important because it is a direct precursor to nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide is where everything starts to become more meaningful. Because nitric oxide is not just another molecule. It is a signaling system inside your blood vessels. It is produced by the endothelial cells that line your arteries and veins. And its job is very specific. It tells your blood vessels to relax, to widen, to open up. When that happens, blood flow increases naturally, smoothly, efficiently. And that increased blood flow is exactly what supports sexual function. In men, it contributes directly to erectile response. In women, it supports tissue sensitivity and lubrication. So when we talk about sexual health, we are really talking about nitric oxide availability. And anything that improves it is directly influencing that system. Watermelon does not force the body into anything unnatural. It simply provides the raw materials your body already knows how to use, a natural biochemical pathway, already built into your physiology. Even small servings can support this process, especially when consumed about an hour or two before intimacy. And what makes it more interesting is that this is not a stimulant effect. It is not artificial. It is not forcing anything. It is simply improving circulation from within. A gentle biological support system that enhances what your body is already capable of doing. And this is only the beginning of the story. Because watermelon is just one of several foods that interact with this nitric oxide pathway in meaningful ways. And once you understand this foundation, everything else starts to make a lot more sense. We will continue building on this next. Now let's move to the second food that plays a far more powerful role in your circulation than most people ever realize: dark chocolate. And I want to be very clear from the beginning here. We are not talking about sugary milk chocolate. We are not talking about processed candy. We are talking about real dark chocolate with a high cacao content, ideally 70% or more. Because inside that darker form of chocolate, there is something biologically active that directly interacts with your vascular system. These compounds are called flavonoids, more specifically flavanols, and their effect is not symbolic or psychological. It is physiological. Flavanols stimulate the inner lining of your blood vessels, the endothelium, to produce more nitric oxide. So once again, we are returning to the same central molecule, nitric oxide, because this is the core mechanism behind healthy blood flow. But dark chocolate does something even more interesting than just increasing production. It also protects what has already been produced. Nitric oxide is fragile. It breaks down quickly when exposed to oxidative stress in the body. And this is where flavanols show their second function. They act as antioxidants. They reduce the breakdown of nitric oxide. They preserve its activity for longer periods of time. So now you have a two-layer effect: more production and longer duration. This combination leads to more sustained vasodilation, more consistent blood flow, and a stronger vascular response overall. And when we translate that into sexual physiology, the effects become very relevant. Improved blood flow means improved sensitivity, improved responsiveness, and more reliable physical readiness in both men and women. But dark chocolate does not stop at vascular chemistry alone. It also interacts with your nervous system. It contains compounds that influence serotonin levels, which contributes to a sense of calm, well-being, and emotional ease. And it also contains phenylethylamine, a compound naturally associated with attraction and excitement states in the brain. So now you are seeing a combined effect: circulatory support, neurological stimulation, and emotional balance, all from a small, simple food source. A small portion, typically 1 to 2 ounces, consumed around an hour before intimacy, can be enough to support these pathways in a noticeable way. And again, this is not about exaggeration. It is about physiology working more efficiently when given the right inputs. Now, let's move to another food that is often underestimated in this conversation: beets. At first glance, beets do not appear to belong in a discussion about sexual health. But once you understand their biochemical role, it becomes very difficult to ignore them. Beets are one of the richest natural sources of dietary nitrates, and these nitrates follow a very specific biological pathway inside your body. When you consume them, they are first converted by bacteria in your mouth, then further processed in your stomach and bloodstream, and finally transformed into nitric oxide. So once again, we are arriving at the same molecule, but through a different route. This redundancy is important because it shows how deeply your body relies on this system. Nitric oxide is not a backup mechanism. It is central to vascular function, and beets provide a direct way to increase its availability. This is why beet juice has been studied extensively in exercise physiology, because improved blood flow improves performance. Improved oxygen delivery improves endurance. But what is often overlooked is that sexual function is also a performance system, a circulatory system under a different form of demand. So the same improvements apply: better blood flow, better vascular flexibility, better response under stimulation. Beets also help regulate blood pressure. And this is important because high blood pressure is one of the most common hidden contributors to reduced sexual function in both men and women. When blood vessels become stiff, they cannot expand properly. When they cannot expand properly, blood flow becomes restricted. And when blood flow becomes restricted, response becomes weaker. Beets help counteract this process by improving vascular elasticity. They make the system more responsive again. And the timing matters as well. Consuming beets or beet juice approximately 2 to 3 hours before intimacy allows enough time for nitric oxide production to rise meaningfully in the bloodstream. The effect is not sudden or artificial. It is gradual, and it reflects your body returning to a more optimal state of function. Now let's move to the fourth food in this sequence: pomegranate. Pomegranate is often seen as just another antioxidant-rich fruit, but its role in vascular health is significantly more complex than that. Pomegranate contains a high concentration of polyphenols. These compounds have strong antioxidant activity, and their main function in this context is protection. Because one of the biggest threats to nitric oxide is oxidative degradation. Free radicals can break it down before it has time to act. Pomegranate helps neutralize those free radicals. This means nitric oxide remains active for longer periods, and vascular dilation becomes more sustained and effective. Studies have shown that regular consumption of pomegranate juice can improve markers of endothelial function, which means the blood vessels themselves begin to operate more efficiently. Some research even suggests improvements in erectile function in men who consume it regularly, not because it is a stimulant, but because it improves the underlying system that controls blood flow. And there is an additional layer here as well. Pomegranate contains natural nitrates, adding another pathway toward nitric oxide production. So once again, we are seeing overlap, multiple mechanisms converging on the same outcome. Improved circulation. A glass of pure, unsweetened pomegranate juice taken about an hour before intimacy can support this vascular environment in a meaningful way. And what makes it even more interesting is that this effect is not limited to sexual function alone. It also supports cardiovascular health more broadly, heart function, blood pressure regulation, and overall vascular resilience. So what we are really discussing here is not just sexual enhancement. It is systemic circulatory improvement, and that distinction matters because it removes the idea that these foods are acting on a single isolated function. They are not. They are improving the entire vascular network your body depends on. And that brings us naturally into the next food in the sequence. Now we come to a food that many people underestimate, partly because of its reputation and partly because they do not connect it with circulation at all. Garlic. At first, garlic feels like something meant for cooking, not for conversations about vascular function or sexual health. But biologically, it plays a very specific and important role. When garlic is crushed or chopped, it produces a compound called allicin. This is the active component that gives garlic its distinctive properties. And allicin interacts directly with the cardiovascular system. One of its key effects is supporting the production of nitric oxide in the endothelium, the inner lining of blood vessels. So again, we are returning to the same central pathway. Improved nitric oxide availability, improved vasodilation, improved blood flow. But garlic does more than that. It also reduces stiffness in blood vessel walls. And this is important because stiffness is one of the hidden barriers to healthy circulation. When vessels lose flexibility, they cannot expand properly when the body demands increased blood flow. That limitation directly affects sexual response in both men and women. Garlic also has strong anti-inflammatory properties. And chronic low-grade inflammation is one of the most overlooked contributors to vascular dysfunction. Inflammation damages the endothelium over time. It disrupts nitric oxide signaling, and it gradually reduces the efficiency of blood flow throughout the body. By reducing inflammation, garlic helps restore a healthier vascular environment. Several studies have shown that regular garlic intake improves blood pressure levels and enhances peripheral circulation, meaning blood flow to the extremities, including regions involved in sexual response. Now, there's also a practical side to garlic that people often bring up immediately: the odor. And yes, it is a real consideration. But from a physiological standpoint, it is not a limiting factor when weighed against its vascular benefits. The effects on circulation are significant enough that they cannot be dismissed for something that can be managed easily with timing or simple oral hygiene. And this leads us into a broader and very important principle. Because at this point, we are no longer talking about individual foods in isolation. We are talking about a system of blood flow, a system of vascular responsiveness, a system that determines how effectively your body responds to stimulation. And one of the most important factors in that system is timing, because what you eat is only part of the equation. When you eat, it matters just as much. And here is something most people never consider. A heavy meal before intimacy can significantly reduce sexual responsiveness. The reason is simple physiology. Digestion requires blood flow. A large meal redirects a significant portion of your circulatory resources toward the stomach and intestines. That means less blood is available elsewhere in the body at the same time, including the regions responsible for sexual arousal. So after a heavy meal, the body is prioritizing digestion over everything else. It is not in a state of readiness for sexual activity. It is in a state of metabolic processing. This is why people often feel sluggish after eating large portions. It is not just fatigue. It is circulatory redistribution. And that redistribution directly affects sexual function. So the principle becomes very clear. Light intake supports responsiveness. Heavy intake reduces it. Now let's bring this together into a more practical understanding. Instead of large meals before intimacy, smaller, targeted food choices create a very different physiological environment. A small amount of watermelon, a piece of dark chocolate, a glass of beet or pomegranate juice, a light use of garlic in food preparation. These are not heavy metabolic loads. They do not compete with circulation in the same way. Instead, they support it. They provide substrates for nitric oxide production. They support endothelial function. And they improve vascular flexibility without overwhelming the digestive system. But we also need to talk about what actively works against this system. Because improving circulation is not just about adding beneficial foods. It is also about reducing interference. Alcohol is one of the most important factors to understand here. In small amounts, alcohol may appear to relax the body. It can create a temporary sense of ease. But physiologically, it has multiple effects that are not supportive of sexual function. It depresses the central nervous system. It reduces neural responsiveness. It decreases sensitivity in genital tissues. And in men, even moderate consumption can interfere with erectile function. What feels like relaxation in the moment can translate into reduced physiological responsiveness. And that difference becomes more noticeable as consumption increases. High-sodium processed foods are another factor. Excess sodium can increase blood pressure and reduce vascular flexibility. When blood vessels become less flexible, they cannot respond efficiently to sexual stimulation signals. Fried foods and heavily processed fats introduce another issue. They promote inflammation. And inflammation is directly linked to reduced endothelial function, which means reduced nitric oxide production, which means reduced blood flow efficiency. Even high-sugar foods can play a role, because rapid blood sugar spikes can temporarily impair vascular dilation and reduce endothelial responsiveness. So what we are seeing here is a clear pattern. The same system that supports general cardiovascular health is the system that supports sexual health. They are not separate. They are the same network operating under different conditions. And this is the key idea that changes how you should think about everything. Your sexual function is not isolated. It is not separate from your heart, your metabolism, or your vascular system. It is an expression of all of them working together. And that means improvement is absolutely possible. Not through extremes, not through complicated interventions, but through consistent, intelligent choices that support blood flow and reduce vascular stress. This is where awareness becomes powerful. Because once you understand the system, you stop guessing. You stop relying on myths or assumptions. And you start making decisions based on actual physiology. At this point, we need to zoom out a little and connect everything you've heard so far into one clear understanding of how the body actually behaves in real-life situations. Because none of this is just about individual foods acting like isolated tools. It is about how your entire circulatory system responds to conditions you create through daily choices. And when it comes to sexual function, the same rule keeps repeating itself in different forms. Good blood flow supports performance. Restricted blood flow limits it. Simple in idea, but deeply important in practice. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions people carry is that sexual health declines randomly with age, or that it is purely hormonal. Hormones do matter, but they are only one part of a much larger system. The vascular system is equally important. In fact, in many cases, it is the primary limiting factor. Because even if hormonal signals are present, they still depend on one thing to actually work in the body: delivery. Hormones and neural signals cannot produce physical responses if blood cannot reach the target tissues efficiently. That is why circulation sits at the center of this entire conversation. And this is where lifestyle patterns begin to matter as much as food choices. Let's start with alcohol again, because it plays a much more complex role than most people realize. Many people assume alcohol improves intimacy because it lowers inhibition. And in very small amounts, that effect can feel noticeable. But physiologically, alcohol is working against the systems that support sexual function. It slows down the central nervous system. It reduces sensitivity in neural pathways. And it interferes with the precise coordination required for sexual response. In men, it can directly impair the ability to achieve or maintain an erection because the vascular and neurological signals become less efficient. In women, it can reduce sensitivity and delay arousal responses by affecting both blood flow and nerve signaling. So while the psychological effect may feel relaxing, the biological effect is more complicated and often counterproductive when it comes to physical responsiveness. And this is an important distinction to understand. What feels good mentally is not always what supports function physically. Now let's talk about something even more overlooked: meal size and timing. Because digestion and sexual function compete for the same resource, blood flow. When you eat a large meal, your body shifts circulation toward your digestive system. The stomach and intestines require a significant increase in blood supply to process food efficiently. That means other systems receive relatively less blood during that time. And if your body is prioritizing digestion, it is not simultaneously optimized for sexual responsiveness. This is why heavy meals often lead to fatigue, reduced energy, and a general lack of physical readiness. It is not laziness. It is physiology. Your body is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. It is just focused on digestion instead of stimulation responsiveness. So when we think about timing, the strategy becomes clear. Smaller, lighter intake before intimacy supports better circulation balance. Heavy meals create competition for blood flow that works against responsiveness. Now let's revisit the foods we discussed earlier, but in a more integrated way. Watermelon, for example, is not just about citrulline. It is about supporting a pathway that leads to nitric oxide production. Dark chocolate is not just a treat. It is a flavonoid-rich food that enhances endothelial function and protects nitric oxide activity. Beets are not just vegetables. They are a direct nitrate source that your body converts into nitric oxide through oral and gut bacteria. Pomegranate is not just a fruit. It is a vascular protector that reduces oxidative stress and helps preserve nitric oxide levels. Garlic is not just a seasoning. It is a compound-rich food that supports vascular flexibility and reduces inflammation in blood vessels. When you put all of this together, a pattern becomes very clear. These foods are not random. They all converge on one biological system, the vascular system, and that system is responsible for far more than just sexual response. It is responsible for heart health, brain function, kidney function, and overall cellular oxygen delivery. So improving circulation is not a niche goal. It is a whole body upgrade. Now, there is another important layer here that often gets ignored in health conversations: stress. Because even if your diet is perfect, stress can override many of these benefits in real time. When you are stressed, your body activates the sympathetic nervous system. This is the fight or flight response. In that state, blood flow is redirected away from non-essential functions and towards survival systems like muscles and the heart. That means sexual function is not prioritized during stress states, because from a biological perspective, reproduction is not urgent in a perceived threat situation. This is why stress is one of the most common hidden causes of reduced sexual performance and reduced arousal responsiveness. It is not psychological weakness. It is physiological prioritization. So managing stress is not optional in this system. It is part of the same vascular equation. And when you combine stress reduction with improved dietary support, something interesting happens. The system becomes more responsive again, not artificially, but naturally, as the conditions for healthy blood flow improve. At this point, the overall message becomes very simple. You are not trying to force anything. You are removing barriers and supporting the body's natural ability to function. Better circulation, better responsiveness, better overall vitality. And this brings us to a very important realization. Sexual health is not separate from cardiovascular health. It is a direct reflection of it. The same arteries, the same endothelial cells, the same nitric oxide pathways. They are all shared systems. So when you improve one, you are improving the other. And when you neglect one, the effects appear everywhere else. This is why understanding your body at this level matters. Because once you see the connection, you stop thinking in isolated problems and start thinking in systems. And systems can be improved. That is where we will continue in the final part. Now we reach the final and most important part of this entire conversation. Because everything we have discussed so far leads to one simple but powerful realization about your body. Your sexual health is not separate from your overall health. It is not a standalone system. It is an expression of how well your circulatory system, your metabolism, your nervous system, and your lifestyle are working together. And when those systems are supported properly, the body does not need to be forced into performance. It simply responds the way it was designed to. Let's bring everything together in a practical way. We talked about foods like watermelon, dark chocolate, beets, pomegranate, and garlic. And each one of them connects back to a single biological pathway: nitric oxide production, endothelial function, blood vessel flexibility, and ultimately, blood flow efficiency. These are not abstract scientific ideas. They are the physical foundation of sexual responsiveness in both men and women. When nitric oxide levels are healthy, blood vessels relax properly. Blood flows more freely, and the tissues that depend on that blood respond naturally. In men, that means stronger and more reliable erectile function. In women, that means improved arousal response, sensitivity, and natural lubrication. But the key point is this: none of this works in isolation. You cannot support circulation through food alone if the rest of your lifestyle is working against it. That is why we also talked about alcohol, heavy meals, processed foods, and stress. Because these factors directly interfere with the same system, alcohol disrupts nervous system signaling and reduces sensitivity. Heavy meals divert blood flow toward digestion instead of responsiveness. High sodium and processed fats reduce vascular flexibility and increase inflammation. Stress activates survival pathways that deprioritize sexual function entirely. So what you are really managing here is balance. On one side, you have foods and habits that support circulation. On the other side, you have patterns that restrict it. And your daily choices determine which side dominates. Now, let's make this very practical. If you want to support your body before intimacy, you are not trying to do anything extreme. You are simply preparing your circulatory system to perform at its best. That can look like a light, intentional approach. A small portion of watermelon to support citrulline and nitric oxide pathways. A piece of dark chocolate to enhance endothelial function. A glass of pomegranate or beet juice to increase vascular efficiency. A small amount of garlic-based food to support circulation and reduce inflammation. And importantly, not overwhelming your digestive system before intimacy. Because digestion and sexual function compete for the same internal resources. And your body cannot prioritize both at maximum intensity at the same time. So lightness matters, timing matters, and balance matters. But there is something even more important than any single food or timing strategy. It is consistency over time. Because vascular health is not built in a single moment. It is shaped by patterns repeated daily. What you eat most of the time determines how responsive your system becomes over time, not just in isolated moments. That means the real goal is not short-term enhancement. It is long-term vascular health. And when your vascular system is healthy, sexual function becomes a reflection of that health, not something you constantly have to manage or think about. Now let's step back and say something very clearly. Sexual health is often surrounded by silence, misunderstanding, and unnecessary shame. But biologically, it is one of the most straightforward expressions of cardiovascular function. It is blood flow. It is nerve signaling. It is tissue responsiveness. It is nothing more and nothing less than that. And when people understand this, the emotional burden around it often begins to lift. Because instead of seeing it as a personal failure or mystery, you begin to see it as physiology. And physiology can be influenced. You are not stuck with random outcomes. You are working with systems that respond to input. That is the real message here. And if there is one final takeaway, it is this: your body is not working against you. It is always responding to the conditions you create. If you support circulation, it responds with better function. If you restrict circulation, it reflects that limitation. And the good news is that many of those conditions are within your control. Not perfectly, not instantly, but meaningfully, through food, through habits, through awareness, and through consistency. So the next time you think about sexual health, do not think of it as something separate or complicated. Think of it as circulation. Think of it as blood flow. Think of it as a system that reflects how well you are taking care of your body as a whole. Because when you do that, the approach becomes simpler and far more effective. And that is where real change begins.